The storm had passed, but the silence that followed was anything but peaceful. In the dead of night, as the group of friends settled into their isolated cabin, a chilling scream echoed through the woods. It wasn't just any scream, it was desperate, filled with raw fear, and unmistakably human. But when they rushed to the windows, there was no one there. No sign of life. The darkness outside felt thicker now, the trees pressing in as if hiding something or someone. In the silence of the night, one question loomed: who screamed? And why did they hear it alone? Before the fear begins, hit like and subscribe, don't miss the chills. Tell us where you're watching from, and brace yourself for stories so terrifying, they'll haunt your night. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, far from the bustling noise of the world. For years, it had been the secret getaway for groups of friends looking to escape the chaos of life. The dirt road leading up to it twisted through dense trees, leaving the world outside behind. No one came here unless they knew the place well, and Alex, Sarah, Mike, Laura, and Evan had been planning this trip for months, excited for a weekend of relaxation and adventure. They had long been in need of a break, a time to reconnect and forget about work, responsibilities, and the constant rush of everyday life. The sun was setting as they made their way up the gravel path, the orange glow spilling through the branches of the trees. The sounds of the city were replaced by the whisper of the wind through the leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. There was an eerie calm that seemed to settle over them as they neared the cabin, a kind of peacefulness that felt too quiet, too still. But they dismissed it, too eager to relax and enjoy the isolation. As the group unloaded their bags and entered the cabin, they were met with an immediate sense of rustic charm. The interior was cozy, with dark wood paneling and a large stone fireplace that promised warmth for the cold nights ahead. The windows, though small, offered a view of the thick woods that surrounded them on all sides. It was exactly what they had hoped for: remote, peaceful, and miles away from anything that could disturb them. After settling in and making a quick dinner, the friends sat around the fire, laughing, reminiscing about old memories, and catching up on the things they had missed while life kept them busy. They played games, told stories, and made plans for tomorrow's hike through the woods. The cabin, though far from civilization, felt like a safe haven. There were no phones, no distractions, just good company and the promise of a quiet weekend. But as the night wore on, a shift began to take place. The quiet that had felt so peaceful at first now seemed a bit unnerving, as if the stillness was waiting for something. The wind began to pick up, and the soft rustling of the trees outside turned into a howling gust, battering against the cabin's walls. Mike, always the more adventurous one, suggested they take a walk to gather firewood before the storm hit. The others hesitated, but Alex, eager to break the monotony, agreed. They bundled up in jackets, grabbed their flashlights, and headed out into the woods. The storm came quickly. What had been a gentle wind moments earlier was now a powerful gust, tearing through the trees with a force that seemed almost unnatural. The friends huddled together as they searched for wood, the sound of the wind making it difficult to hear each other. As they gathered the last of the wood they could find, Sarah, who had been trailing behind, slipped on the wet ground and twisted her ankle. The pain shot up her leg, and she cried out in agony. "Sarah!" Alex called, rushing over to her. Mike knelt down beside her, trying to help. "You okay?" The rest of the group crowded around her, but it was clear she couldn't walk. The storm had made the path back to the cabin nearly impossible to navigate, and the darkness was closing in faster than they anticipated. Sarah's ankle was swollen, and it seemed to be more than just a minor twist. With no other choice, they decided to make their way back to the cabin as best they could, helping Sarah along. The journey back was slow and difficult. The wind howled, and the rain began to pour down, drenching them as they made their way through the dark woods. The sound of the trees creaking and the wind pushing against them created an ominous feeling, but it was the silence between them that felt most unsettling. The deeper they moved into the woods, the less they could hear the familiar sounds of the storm. There was an eerie quiet that had fallen over them. They moved quickly, eager to get back to the safety of the cabin. As they approached the clearing, Alex looked around and noticed something strange. For just a moment, the wind stopped. The silence felt deafening. The air around them seemed thick, heavy. Alex felt the hair on the back of their neck stand up. But there was no time to dwell on it. The cabin was just ahead. They made it inside, bringing Sarah with them and quickly making her comfortable by the fire. As they sat down to assess the situation, Mike suggested they rest for a while until the storm passed. The tension in the air was palpable, but the friends tried to ignore it, turning their attention to Sarah's injury. They could deal with it in the morning, after the storm passed. The night seemed to settle into an uneasy calm. They sat around the fire, trying to distract themselves from the growing discomfort, but something felt off. The stillness was not comforting anymore, it felt suffocating. They could hear the wind outside, but nothing else. No animals, no sounds of nature, no distant voices, just the eerie silence. Then, as the last of the firelight flickered out, it happened. A scream, a loud, piercing cry, echoed through the woods outside. The scream sent shivers down their spines. It wasn't an animal's cry. It was human, agonizing, desperate. The friends jumped to their feet, exchanging nervous glances. What was that? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. They rushed to the windows, peering out into the night, but there was nothing. The storm had quieted, leaving behind only the darkness. No sign of anyone. No sign of anything. The silence crept back in, suffocating and unsettling. The scream had felt so real. And yet, they were alone. The silence that had enveloped the cabin after the scream was unlike anything they had ever experienced. It was a silence that gnawed at their nerves, pressing against the walls and inside their minds. Each of the friends stood frozen, staring at the dark, rain-soaked forest outside the window, trying to make sense of what they had just heard. Did anyone else hear that? Laura's voice broke the tension, barely above a whisper. Her eyes were wide with fear, darting from one friend to another. No one spoke for a moment. I heard it, Mike said finally, his voice heavy with disbelief. He ran a hand through his wet hair, trying to shake off the terror that had crept into his chest. It sounded like someone was in pain. Alex turned from the window and looked at the group, their faces pale and drawn. Sarah, who was still seated by the fire, seemed to shrink further into herself, her injured ankle propped up but her attention entirely focused on the conversation. It sounded human, didn't it? She asked, her voice fragile, like she was afraid to say it aloud. Yeah, it definitely wasn't an animal, Mike replied. But there's no one out there. I mean, we're the only ones in these woods for miles. Evan, who had been standing by the door, looked uneasy. He had his arms crossed tightly against his chest, as if trying to hold in his fear. Maybe it's just the wind, or a wild animal. Those things can sound pretty disturbing when they're injured or scared. Laura shook her head. No, it wasn't an animal. That scream was different. It wasn't like anything I've ever heard. The group fell silent again. The wind was still howling outside, rattling the windows, but the scream, if that's what it had truly been, had come from the woods just beyond the cabin. It hadn't been muffled by the storm. If anything, it had been amplified by the emptiness of the wilderness. The more they stood there, debating what had happened, the more the uncertainty grew. Fear started to settle between them like a cold weight, making every word feel distant and unimportant. Mike stepped back toward the fireplace and sat down heavily. We need to stay calm, he said, though his own voice betrayed his anxiety. The storm's messing with our heads. We're exhausted, and we've been cooped up here all day. The cold is making us all jumpy. I don't know, Sarah began, her voice trembling. It felt too real. It felt like it was calling to us. Calling to us? Evan scoffed. Come on, Sarah. It was probably some wild animal in the distance. Nothing more. The argument seemed to drift off into nothingness. No one was truly listening anymore. Every thought in their minds was consumed by the scream, replaying it over and over, the raw anguish still fresh in their minds. Minutes passed, and the conversation finally died down. The group reluctantly settled back into the dimly lit cabin, but the unease lingered, thick in the air. Alex stood by the fire, staring into the flames as though seeking comfort in their warmth. But there was no comfort to be found. They tried to distract themselves. Mike suggested they play cards to take their minds off things. The group reluctantly agreed, but the game felt forced. The card shuffling was too loud in the quiet room, the click of the cards echoing too sharply. Even the fire crackling in the hearth felt unnatural, like it was making too much noise in the heavy silence. The storm raged on outside, and as the night wore on, the shadows in the cabin deepened. Despite the warmth from the fire, Alex could feel the cold creeping in. Not the physical cold, but the kind that gnawed at the edges of your mind, making you question the very air you breathed. The room felt like it was closing in, and the longer they stayed inside, the more it seemed to press against them. Even the faintest sound, the rustling of their clothes, the shuffle of a chair, seemed to carry an unnatural weight. Then it happened again. A scream. A shrill, desperate cry pierced the air, louder this time, unmistakably human. This time, it was closer. Alex jumped up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. They rushed to the window, heart pounding in their chest, but the view outside was obscured by the driving rain. The trees swayed violently in the wind, their limbs creaking under the weight of the storm. The scream echoed once more, but it was cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of the rain and the wind in its wake. "I heard it again," Laura said, her voice breaking as she backed away from the window, eyes wide with terror. "It's outside," Sarah gasped, her voice shaking. "Someone's out there. Someone is screaming for help." Mike ran to the door. "We need to go out there," he said, his tone urgent. "If someone's out there, we can't just leave them. We have to help." "No," Evan shouted, his voice frantic. "We can't go out there in the storm. It's too dangerous. It could be a trap. We don't know who or what is out there." But despite his protests, Mike was already fumbling with the door, his hand on the handle. "If it's someone in trouble, we can't just sit here. We're not going to let someone die out there. We don't even know if it's a person," Evan argued, his voice tinged with desperation. "It could be anything. We're just hearing things in the storm." Mike stopped for a moment, glancing back at the group. His expression was tense, conflicted. What if it's not? What if it's real? What if someone's out there right now, needing our help? Laura, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "We don't know what's out there. It could be anyone or anything. We don't even know if it's human." She looked at the others, her face pale. "But if we go out there, we might never come back." The group fell into an uneasy silence again. The wind howled louder outside, rattling the windows, as if the very forest itself was alive and pressing in on them. Alex glanced at each of their faces. There was a shared sense of dread between them, but no one spoke it aloud. They all knew what the other was thinking, who was screaming out there, and why were they the only ones who could hear it. "I think we should wait," Sarah finally said, her voice soft but firm. "We're not equipped to deal with whatever's out there. Let's just wait until morning and then figure out what happened." Alex nodded, agreeing with her. The thought of stepping into that unknown darkness, into a forest filled with unseen dangers, felt like an invitation to disaster. But the scream, the terror in that cry, it was impossible to ignore. They all felt it. That fear, that call for help, was something that none of them could shake. It would linger with them, haunting them until they had answers. Hours passed in tense silence. No one slept. The storm outside seemed to grow more violent, its howling winds and driving rain mixing with the unsettling silence that had fallen over the cabin. But as the night stretched on, the group realized that there would be no more answers tonight. The questions would have to wait. But in the dark, no one could shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. The hours following the second scream were filled with a palpable tension that made it almost impossible to think straight. The cabin, once warm and cozy, now felt like a cage, a place where the walls closed in with each passing minute. No one spoke, except in hushed tones, as though the very air was thick with suspicion. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room, but it offered little warmth or comfort. The night stretched endlessly before them. Alex couldn't help but glance nervously at the windows, as if expecting something or someone to appear at any moment. The storm outside had subsided somewhat, but the silence left in its wake felt unnatural. It wasn't the usual calm of a storm passing. This silence felt foreboding, as though something was waiting for them to make the next move. The friends, still shaken by what had happened, remained huddled in the living room, avoiding looking at each other for too long. They each seemed to be lost in their own thoughts, trying to make sense of the terrifying experience. But there was a shared unspoken feeling that hung between them, distrust. It was impossible to ignore. I think we should leave, Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence. Her eyes were wide with fear, her ankle still wrapped in a makeshift bandage from when she had fallen earlier. She winced with every slight movement, but the pain seemed like the least of her worries. We can't stay here. Whatever is out there, it's not right. Mike, who had been pacing in front of the fire, stopped abruptly. He turned to face her, his face strained with the tension of the situation. You want to leave now? In the middle of the night, in the storm, with no clear path? Are you crazy? We'd never make it. We have to try. Sarah shot back, her voice growing more desperate. What if that scream was someone in trouble? What if there's something out there trying to hurt us? She paused for a second, her gaze shifting from one face to another. We can't just sit here and wait to be picked off one by one. But in the dark, no one could shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. Her words hung in the air like an unspoken truth. The idea of being picked off, of being watched, was a reality no one wanted to face. The scream they had heard, real or imagined, was just the beginning. Something was out there, something real, and it wasn't just a figment of their collective anxiety. Alex could feel it in their bones. The question was no longer whether to leave, but whether they could trust each other enough to survive the night. Mike's eyes darted toward the door as if the darkness outside were a tangible entity, something that could pull them into the woods with a single breath. His mind raced, processing the danger of moving blindly into that darkness. The idea of abandoning the cabin felt wrong, but staying here felt equally dangerous. We're not prepared for a trek in this storm. We don't know what's out there, or what we'll be walking into. We stay here and figure out what's going on, Mike finally said, though his voice didn't sound as confident as it should have. He was the type who preferred action over indecision, but the unknown of the night was starting to chip away at that certainty. Laura spoke up next, her voice softer but no less afraid. But if we stay, we're just sitting ducks. Whoever, or whatever, is out there has the advantage. We've already heard them scream twice. What's next? I agree, Evan added, rubbing his temples in frustration. We can't just keep sitting here hoping this will go away. Something's not right. He paced back and forth near the door, his mind spinning in confusion. His usual calm demeanor was absent, replaced with the same anxious energy that seemed to infect them all. The arguments seemed to circle in an endless loop, each suggestion more desperate than the last. No one was ready to trust the others completely. The fear was growing, but so was the suspicion. Was one of them hiding something? Were they all simply jumping at shadows, letting fear overtake reason? Or was there truly something out there, waiting to strike when they least expected it? The tension in the room began to rise, the silence between them stretching longer with each passing second. Trust was beginning to feel like a fragile thread, about to snap at any moment. Laura's voice cut through the quiet again. Mike's right about one thing. We can't just go running out into the woods without a plan. But we also can't ignore what's happening. We need to stay alert. We need to watch each other. Everyone fell silent, eyes shifting nervously. Watching each other. Trusting each other. It was easier said than done. I don't know who to trust anymore, Sarah muttered under her breath, looking directly at Laura, her gaze filled with suspicion. The room seemed to freeze at the words. I don't know if someone here is playing some sick joke, or if we're all just losing our minds. The accusation hung in the air like a cold gust. The group froze. The atmosphere in the room had changed. There were no more gentle words, no more camaraderie. The question of trust had been raised, and it couldn't be ignored anymore. I'm not playing any joke, Laura snapped, her voice low but heated. None of us are. We're all scared out of our minds right now. You think I could fake that scream, that terror? I heard it, too. But Sarah's words had already planted a seed of doubt in everyone's minds. A quick glance between the others revealed what had been brewing under the surface, the fear that someone in their group might be toying with their emotions, driving them into a frenzy. But who could it be? Who would go that far? They had been friends for years, people they had trusted with their lives. I don't know what's going on, but this isn't helping, Evan said, his voice sharp. We're supposed to be a team. We can't start accusing each other. If we want to get through this, we need to work together, not tear each other apart. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence once again. The fire crackled, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill creeping into their minds. No one seemed willing to speak further, the weight of suspicion and fear too much to bear. It was the worst thing that could have happened. Paranoia had begun to settle in. Hours passed, each one dragging longer than the last. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, seemed amplified in the heavy quiet. It was as though the world had been swallowed up by darkness, and they were alone, surrounded by their own thoughts and doubts. Then, suddenly, a noise. A soft scrape against the cabin door. They all jumped, eyes darting toward the entrance. Was it the wind? Or was someone or something out there? Mike slowly moved toward the door, his eyes scanning the room. He reached for the handle, his hand trembling, but before he could open it, the sound came again, a faint tap. A soft, almost imperceptible knock, barely audible over the howling wind outside. Who's there? Mike called out, his voice firm, though his heart raced. The group stood still, waiting for a response. But there was only silence. Another tap. This time, louder. Hello! Mike shouted again, this time with more urgency. The seconds seemed to stretch on forever as the group waited, their breath held in the stillness. Then, to their shock, the door creaked open. It wasn't much, just an inch or so, but it was enough to send a shiver down their spines. The room was silent. Everyone stared at the door in disbelief, waiting for whatever was out there to make itself known. The wind had stopped, leaving only the eerie quiet hanging between them. I think we need to leave now, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Her eyes were wide, filled with panic. We can't stay here any longer. Whatever's out there is coming for us. But as they stood frozen, waiting for the next sound, a realization began to sink in, there was no escape. Whether they stayed in the cabin or ventured into the woods, the terror had already found them. It wasn't the outside world that was the danger. It was something far more unsettling, the growing distrust between them. The fear of one another. The door had creaked open, but no one moved. No one spoke. They all stood frozen, staring at the sliver of darkness that stretched between the doorframe, as if something or someone was waiting outside. The stillness of the room pressed down on them, suffocating the last remnants of rational thought. Fear, raw and primal, spread through the group like wildfire, igniting every inch of their bodies with dread. The door had been opened. They had heard it. But no one had entered. No one had responded to their frantic calls. It felt like a trap, a moment of quiet before something unimaginable struck. Mike, his hand still resting on the door handle, hesitated for a long moment, weighing the decision to open it further. The fear in the room was palpable, and the tension between them all had reached its breaking point. The unspoken accusations, the suspicions of one another, had only intensified with every passing hour. Is anyone else out there? Laura whispered, her voice barely audible. She had been the first to suggest they go out and investigate, but now that they were faced with the unknown, her bravery had quickly crumbled into something more fragile. Who's out there? Mike didn't answer. He stood there, staring at the door, his body tense and coiled. The silence from the other side grew unbearable. The longer they waited, the more the fear twisted their thoughts. What if it was someone trying to lure them outside? What if it was a trap, and they were being watched right now, waiting for them to make a mistake? Alex, who had been silently observing the group, finally took a step forward. Their heart was pounding in their chest. The scream they had heard twice now was still fresh in their mind. There was no doubt that something was out there, but whether it was human or something else was impossible to say. We can't just stand here, Alex said, their voice steady but edged with tension. We need to figure out what's going on. If someone's out there, we need to know. We can't stay locked in here forever. Sarah, who had been sitting by the fire, flinched at Alex's words. Her injured ankle was throbbing painfully, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the gnawing fear in her gut. She stared at the door, the soft creaking of the wind outside now adding to the growing sense of dread. I agree, she said quietly, but her voice trembled. But I don't think I can do it. I can't go out there. Not after everything we've heard. Not after what we've seen. She glanced at each of them, her eyes full of uncertainty. Something's not right, and I don't think I can trust any of you anymore. The words hit the group like a slap in the face, each one feeling the weight of the accusation. Trust had already been hanging by a thread, and now, Sarah's words felt like the final crack in their fragile bond. Their collective fear had driven them into a corner, and now their paranoia had seeped into every word, every glance. They were no longer sure if they could trust each other. Are you saying one of us is responsible for what's happening? Mike asked, his voice rising, tension lacing each word. His anger was palpable, and his eyes burned with frustration. I don't know, Sarah replied, her eyes wide. I don't know who or what is out there, but I'm starting to think that maybe the thing we should be most afraid of is each other. The room went dead silent, each person processing Sarah's words in their own way. Her accusation was like a spark igniting a fire, and the quiet between them now felt thicker, heavier. It was a moment where the truth seemed to hang just out of reach, just beyond their grasp. They couldn't decide whether to trust their instincts or their growing fear. But before anyone could respond, the door creaked again. A low, almost imperceptible sound. But it was enough to snap them all into action. The door had been opened earlier, but now it seemed as though something was outside, something close. Mike, his expression set with determination, stepped back from the door and motioned for the others to stay quiet. Stay behind me, he whispered. We'll open the door slowly and see what's out there. If it's a person, we'll handle it. But we need to stay calm. Everyone stay together. They all nodded, even though the idea of stepping outside into the darkness was terrifying. They had no choice. The silence, the terror that clung to the cabin, had become unbearable. Mike turned the door handle cautiously and pushed it open just enough to peek outside. The night air was cold and damp, the trees around the cabin swaying in the wind. The only sounds were the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a branch. The world outside seemed just as still as the cabin inside. There was no one. Nothing. But as Mike stepped further out, he froze. Something wasn't right. The air felt different, charged with a heavy, oppressive weight. And then he saw it. Across the clearing, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure. A shadow, tall and unmoving. The figure was facing them, standing still in the night, its form shrouded by the deep shadows cast by the trees. A cold shiver ran down Mike's spine, and he felt his breath catch in his throat. There was no sound from the figure, no movement. It was as though it was waiting for them to make a move. The air grew colder still. Mike. Laura's voice trembled behind him, the fear in her tone palpable. What do we do? Mike didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. He stood there, staring at the figure in the distance, his mind racing. It was almost as if time had stopped, as if the very night had frozen in place, waiting to see what would happen next. We need to go back inside, Mike finally said, his voice tight. He closed the door slowly, his eyes never leaving the figure outside. The door shut with a soft click, and the group breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had all seen it, too. The shadow, the shape standing out there, was real. Who was that? Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with panic. What was that? I don't know, Mike said, his voice unsteady. But we're not going out there again. We need to lock up and stay inside. Whatever it is, it's not safe. But deep down, Mike knew that staying inside was no longer an option. The shadow, whatever it was, wasn't just a figure in the woods. It had seen them. It knew they were here. The night dragged on, and the friends huddled together in silence. They stayed by the fire, but even its warmth couldn't chase away the chill that had taken root in their hearts. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind, made them jump. They were trapped, alone in this tiny cabin with the unknown lurking just outside. And yet, it wasn't just the figure outside that had them terrified anymore. It was the question that hung between them like a dark cloud. Who could they trust? As they sat in the darkness, no one spoke. They didn't need to. The air in the room was thick with suspicion, with fear. Their minds were unraveling, and with each passing second, they realized that the true terror wasn't what was lurking outside. It was what was growing between them. The fire in the hearth flickered, casting long, quivering shadows across the room, but the warmth from the flames could not reach the chill that had settled deep in the hearts of the group. The figure outside, standing silent and still in the dark, had been burned into their minds. No one could escape the image, the tall, shadowy form, watching them, waiting. The hours passed slowly, each one more suffocating than the last. They didn't speak much anymore. The tension between them was like a tight cord pulled too taut, ready to snap. Each friend sat quietly, eyes darting around the room, the weight of suspicion heavy in the air. "I think we should leave," Sarah finally said, her voice small but firm. She had been quiet for hours, staring into the flames with a haunted look in her eyes. "We can't stay here. Not after everything." Mike looked up from the door, where he had been standing, watching for any signs of movement outside. His eyes were tired, his face drawn with exhaustion. "I know you want to, Sarah. But if we go out there now, we'll be walking into whatever that thing is. We don't even know what it wants." "It doesn't matter what it wants," Sarah exclaimed, her frustration bubbling over. "We've been stuck in this cabin for hours, waiting for something to happen. What's worse? Staying here, or facing whatever that is?" Alex, who had been silent for the past few minutes, stood up and walked over to the window. They didn't want to admit it, but Sarah was right. The fear that had settled over them was starting to feel unbearable. "We don't know if it's even real," Alex said, their voice hoarse. "Maybe it's just a trick of the mind. We've all been on edge, the storm messing with our heads. But we've all heard it." "That scream," Evan chimed in, his voice tight with tension. "The one we couldn't explain. And now that figure. It's not a trick." Mike turned sharply, his face tense. "What do you suggest we do, her? Go out there, guns blazing? What if it's something worse than just a figure in the woods? What if it's something—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. For a moment, there was silence. The weight of Mike's words hung in the air, settling between them like a heavy stone. The unknown, the fear of the unseen, was worse than any tangible threat. And now, it wasn't just the outside world they were scared of. It was each other. "I'm going out there," Sarah said suddenly, standing up, determination in her eyes. "I'm not sitting here waiting to be picked off one by one. Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Her words hung in the room, reverberating with the weight of finality. She wasn't asking for permission. She had made up her mind. "Wait, Sarah, no," Laura shouted, rushing to her. "This isn't the way to handle this. You can't just go out there alone. It's insane." But Sarah shook her head. "We're already falling apart in here. I can't sit here and let that thing out there just watch us." She grabbed her jacket, slipping it on with haste. "If we're going to die, I'm going out on my own terms." Mike stepped forward, blocking her path. "You're not going anywhere, Sarah. We stick together. We figure this out. There's strength in numbers, not in running out there by yourself." Sarah stood there for a moment, her face pale and set with fear, but also resolve. She shook her head again. "I can't do this anymore." Without another word, Sarah shoved past Mike and made her way to the door. "Stop her," Laura cried, but it was too late. Sarah was already at the door, her hand on the handle. "Sarah, don't do this," Evan shouted. But Sarah didn't answer. She opened the door. The wind outside had died down, but the night felt colder now. The trees in the distance swayed eerily in the dark. The stillness was suffocating. Sarah stepped outside, and for a brief moment, everything went quiet again. Then, as if the world itself had been holding its breath, the scream came again. This time, it was so close, so loud, it felt like it was coming from inside the cabin. The door slammed shut behind Sarah with a force that rattled the walls, sending a shockwave of fear through the group. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, colder. It was a scream of pure agony, one that seemed to tear at the very fabric of their souls. "Sarah!" Mike shouted, running to the door. "Sarah, get back here." But when he opened the door, there was nothing. Nothing but the night, dark, empty, and cold. The air felt thick with dread. The only sound now was the wind in the trees and the pounding of their own hearts. "She's gone," Laura whispered, her voice quivering. "She's really gone." Mike stood frozen, staring into the void outside. He felt paralyzed, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Sarah had left them. She had gone out there alone, and now she was gone. "No," Evan murmured. "She can't be gone. She was just..." But his words were cut off as another scream split the silence. This time, it wasn't from outside. It came from within the cabin itself. It was a muffled scream, as though someone was trapped in the walls. A collective gasp filled the room. It was impossible. The scream had come from the interior. They had all heard it. The group looked around, frantic. "Where is it coming from?" Laura screamed. "Where is it?" "From the walls," Mike shouted, his voice breaking. "It's coming from the walls." There was no time to process the panic, no time to think. The sound was too real, too close. It was right under their skin, like something was clawing its way out. With trembling hands, Alex ran to the wall near the door, pressing their ear to it, listening to the muffled noise coming from inside. It sounded almost human, but distorted. It was unmistakable. It was a scream, and it was alive, trapped somewhere inside the house. "How is this possible?" Laura cried, her voice cracking under the weight of the horror. "Who is doing this?" Evan backed away, shaking his head. "It's not possible. It can't be real. It's just..." The door to the cabin suddenly slammed shut again. No wind, no movement. Just the unnatural sound of the door closing, echoing in the room like a death knell. Alex's heart raced as they scanned the room. The fear had consumed them, and it wasn't just from what was outside anymore. It was inside. It was in the cabin, in the walls, in the very air they breathed. The house itself had become a prison. They had been wrong. They weren't just being hunted. They had become part of the horror. They were trapped in a nightmare, and now it was clear. There was no escape. "Do you hear that?" Evan whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding in their ears. The others froze, listening. The room was so still now, the silence suffocating, as if everything was holding its breath. And then they heard it, another scream, sharper than before, closer, coming from behind them. Whipping around, they saw nothing. Only the dim shadows cast by the firelight, flickering across the walls. But the scream was unmistakable. It was coming from the cabin itself. They couldn't trust the walls anymore. They couldn't trust the house. And they sure as hell couldn't trust each other. The real horror wasn't just outside. It wasn't even the shadow lurking in the woods. It was inside, growing with each passing moment. And now, they had nowhere to run. The cabin had become a tomb. The wind outside continued its violent battering, but it felt distant now, almost insignificant in comparison to the terror that had taken hold of the group. They had tried to ignore it, to fight it, but now they all knew the truth. The true enemy wasn't just the unseen figure in the woods, it wasn't the scream that had torn through their peaceful night. It was the house itself. It had become a living, breathing entity, and it was working against them. Sarah was gone. The fear in her eyes, the last desperate words she'd spoken before rushing out into the night, those would be the last remnants of her they would ever see. And now, it was as if the cabin had claimed her, like it had claimed something from each of them, bit by bit, until there was nothing left but distrust and terror. The screaming continued, now coming from inside the walls of the cabin. Each scream was filled with anguish, each one somehow worse than the last. It felt as though they were trapped in a nightmare, a waking horror that refused to let them go. The walls themselves seemed to hum with the sound, reverberating through the very structure of the cabin, echoing in their ears until it felt like it was inside their minds. Alex stood at the center of the room, staring at the door that had slammed shut just moments ago. It was locked now, a heavy weight hanging over them. There was no way to escape, no way to leave without facing whatever was out there and whatever was within. The silence between the screams was almost as terrifying as the cries themselves. "We can't just sit here," Mike said, his voice cracking with frustration. He was pacing again, back and forth in front of the fire. "We need to find Sarah. We need to know what's happening. We can't just hide here and wait for it to come for us." Laura, who had been silent for too long, finally spoke up, her voice trembling. "What if she's gone? What if what's out there took her?" "Don't say that," Evan snapped. "We don't know anything for sure. We can't give up on her." "But we don't even know what's out there," Laura countered, her fear turning to anger. "We've heard screams, seen shadows, and now there's this thing inside the cabin, controlling everything. We're trapped. None of us are safe anymore." The words felt like a punch to the gut, but they rang with undeniable truth. They had been trapped in the house, isolated from the world outside. The terror of being stuck in this hellish place, surrounded by things they couldn't explain, had made their minds unravel in ways they hadn't thought possible. Sarah's words echoed in Alex's mind, "I don't think I can trust any of you anymore." That sentiment had been a slow burn, but now it was full-blown fire. Every glance, every motion, every breath they took felt heavy with suspicion. Could one of them be behind this? Was someone else playing a sick joke on the group, manipulating them into fear and paranoia? Or worse yet, had the cabin itself turned them against each other? Alex turned away from the group and walked over to the window, trying to peer out into the dark. The world outside was black and silent, the storm having passed, leaving only the oppressive weight of the night. There was no sign of movement, no figure lurking in the shadows. "What's happening?" Alex whispered to themselves, pressing their forehead to the cool glass. "Why are we doing this to each other? Why can't we just stay calm?" They heard a soft sound behind them, a scraping noise against the floorboards. Spinning around, they saw Evan, who had knelt down by the fire, his face pale and his eyes wide with something that looked like terror. His hand was trembling as it reached out to grab the fire poker. "Evan, what are you doing?" Mike asked, a hard edge in his voice. Evan's head whipped toward him. "There's something in the fireplace." Something moved. The group froze. The room suddenly felt colder. The fire, which had been crackling only moments ago, now seemed distant, as though it was somehow dimmer. "Something moved?" Laura asked, her voice barely a whisper, as though she didn't want to admit it aloud. Evan nodded, wide-eyed, his hand still gripping the poker tightly. "I swear I saw it. It's not just the logs shifting, it's something else." The tension in the room ratcheted up again. There was no more ignoring the truth. Something was in the cabin, and it wasn't just outside. It wasn't just the figure in the woods, or the sounds of things moving in the night. The house itself was part of this nightmare, and it was feeding on their fear. Alex walked over to Evan, their own heart racing with a mixture of dread and disbelief. They knelt down beside him, staring at the darkened fireplace. Nothing moved, but the air felt thick with something they couldn't see, like it was hiding just beyond the reach of their senses. "I'm going to check it," Alex said, their voice low but determined. "I have to know what's going on. We all need to know. I'll go in, check the chimney, see if there's something trapped in there, maybe a critter. I'll be right back." "Don't," Laura begged. "Don't go alone. Please. It's not safe." Alex hesitated, the desire to get to the bottom of it pulling them forward, but Laura's words carried a weight they couldn't ignore. They were all alone in this place, surrounded by a malevolent presence they couldn't understand. If they split up, if they tried to face this thing alone, there was no guarantee anyone would make it out. Mike stepped forward. "I'll go with you," he said, his voice firm. "If something's in there, we'll deal with it together." Alex nodded, and the two of them slowly approached the fireplace. The room was deathly silent, save for the occasional crackle from the hearth. As they reached the fireplace, they each knelt, one on either side, examining the stone wall and the base of the chimney. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to press in closer. The moment Alex reached for the poker, the room seemed to exhale a breath, like the cabin itself was reacting to their movement. They hesitated, then gripped the metal rod, lifting it slowly. And then, just as they were about to reach into the chimney, the sound came again. The scream. Not from outside, but from within the walls, from the very foundation of the cabin. The sound was sharp and jagged, like someone was being torn apart. "No!" Laura screamed, rushing forward. "No, no, no!" But it was too late. Alex and Mike both turned to see the walls tremble. The whole room seemed to shift, the very air feeling like it was vibrating, charged with an unnatural energy. The fireplace began to shake, and suddenly, the logs inside flew up, slamming into the ceiling. The walls buckled, and the screeching noise that filled the room reached a deafening crescendo. "Get away from the fireplace," Evan yelled, pulling Laura back. Alex and Mike both stumbled backward, nearly falling over as the chimney itself seemed to explode outward. From the fireplace, something dark and twisted emerged. It was a figure, not human, not anything that made sense. It was long and contorted, covered in a black, oily substance, with hands that reached out like claws. The face was a grotesque mask of nothingness, a gaping hole where eyes should have been, just the hollow stare of pure darkness. The shadow moved quickly, faster than they could react. It lunged toward Mike, and in an instant, the room was filled with screams. The darkness of the cabin seemed to swallow them whole, and the air became thick, suffocating. Alex felt themselves freeze, unable to move as the figure turned its unseeing face toward them. The air seemed to thicken, as though the very walls of the house had become a trap. But then, in an instant, everything stopped. The figure vanished. The scream stopped. The room fell into a heavy, terrifying silence. They were left in the dark, gasping for breath, unsure of what had just happened. The fire was dimming, and in the quiet, they finally realized the truth. The cabin had never been just a house. It had always been part of the terror. The walls held the memories of all those who had stepped inside, and now it was their turn.